Good morning. It is so nice to see all of you here. There's a lot of familiar faces. I'm Stephanie Porter. I'm the outreach agronomist at the Illinois Soybean Association. And today I want to give you a little bit of my insights based on not only being out in the field this summer, but also based on a lot of data that Deanna and Whitney have gathered this year. So we are going to be focusing on sulfur, which was kind of a hot topic, not only with our board members, farmers that came up to us, those that filled out our growing concern survey that we'll talk about, that you're all welcome to fill out. But this is one of the things that personally on our own farm, we have been applying sulfur on corn, but the question was, should we be applying sulfur on our soybeans? And it seemed a lot of growers had those questions. Just like DeLoss said, this is the first year, the first focus of our on-farm trial network at the Illinois Soybean Association. So I guess the way that I would summarize it, the takeaways for the on-farm trial network and to market it is, it connects growers to some researchers in some aspects, but we're taking a look at bigger size plots, right? So that can be good and bad in cases, but we want to get a little bit more, well, you know, Dr. Sybil, who's sitting in the back, says this. Sean Castile, Dr. Castile says this, but it's not happening on my farm. So there's those that are wanting to, maybe they've never done an on-farm trial before, and so we offer these services to them where we can help them set up the trial. We can work with them. They don't know how to maybe transfer their data. They've never done that before. We're also working with farmers that are very well aware of all those things. They're already doing trials on their own farm, but they want to maybe see if we can get the same type of data that they're getting. We also offer reports, obviously data, summarized data, but learn about their soils perhaps, also texture, which we'll talk about, but a lot of different reports that they get, and they also get to network with other farmers. We have meetings virtually, as well as at the end of the year or the beginning of the year, to help maybe set up that trial, but also maybe to share some data. So I would be remiss if I didn't start out with this slide. It makes me think back to college. So that was quite a while ago. So there's a couple of college mates here today. So you think Dr. Fabian Fernandez, who's in Minnesota right now, I remember him doing a lot of sulfur work. I've heard that a lot of it was not published, but we started to find out that we just didn't probably have as much sulfur in our soils as we used to. This was due to the 1907 Clean Air Act. So obviously this was a good thing. We cleaned up the environment. A lot of those emissions that were coming from different avenues, industry, engines, that was coming down as acid rain. We're cleaning up the environment. That's a good thing. But it also made us have less sulfur in the ground, and so that's where we were at. So this is a latest statistic from Darby that I grabbed. So basically, according to the US EPA, there's 95% less of the sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere at this point. And we also need to go ahead and cover some points. Why do we even need sulfur? What's important about it in the plant? So these are the slides that you may not be able to read as well, but they drive chlorophyll synthesis and energy, so this is needed for photosynthesis. That's pretty important. It's also for nitrogen fixation. So, you know, soybeans are really cool like that. They fix their own nitrogen. Sulfur helps in that. That's also, in my mind, very important. And then enhanced biomass accumulation. This has to do with yield. We like that word, right? You want to get more yield. Sulfur helps with that. And then lastly, and I don't know if it's most important, but it's one of the things that's a lot talked about, is it has to do with the protein within the grain protein levels within the soybean, and nitrogen also contributes to that. This is a quick slide to give an example of how our trials are currently set up. So the trial size is a minimum of 40 acres. That's very flexible. Obviously, we have all fields are not square rectangle, so very flexible by shape. We have 4 replications of not only the control, but also the sulfur treatment. And so that's about 8 plots. It is 8 plots. And then the plot width is greater or equal to 60 foot, or 2 times the combine header. And we always want to try to reduce that combine or harvest effect. And this is my quick summary. Obviously, all protocols can be found on fieldadvisor.org if you want to read every nitty-gritty word. But I summarized, my summer vacation basically here. So this was what Darby and I and others on my team collected and did in the field throughout the year. So beginning in the spring, we collected baseline soil sampling data, and we also did baseline soil sampling. Obviously, we tried to do that before sulfur was applied, but I will be totally transparent with you that sometimes we had a little issue with Mother Nature this year, if you weren't aware, and we'll talk more about that. But sometimes it was sampled after the sulfur was applied. We also did soil health sampling. We told the growers, which some of them are sitting here, that apply 30 pounds of sulfur. So this is a much higher rate. This is a total of 30 pounds applied. Much higher rate than what's normally recommended. So normal recommendation would be 15 to 20 pounds. So just think that we're just throwing the works at it. Also, again, we had a control of no sulfur added, but we also had, the actual other treatment was a sulfur treatment. Also want to be transparent that we may want to change in the coming year, that some of the controls did not have an equal amount of nitrogen in them, some did, as what was in the sulfur treatment. So sulfur products obviously have some nitrogen in them, so think about that, and I'll try to point that out throughout the presentation. And then we collected historical management data. Darby helped me out oftentimes, especially because of the tissue testing. We had to tag team. It was pretty, it took a lot of work, Connor, just so you know. And so we tissue tested and tried to do that about R1 in between R2. That was I love challenges. That was a great challenge. It worked out unfortunately, worked out really well this year because we had such a wide range of planting dates, which we'll talk about, thanks to Mother Nature. And then we collected spring management form data. Lastly, at the end of the season, we collected not all, but some of the more interesting, perhaps, locations. We collected plant height, pod count. We did, obviously, yield data collection, and now we're at the point where we're doing final reports and meetings. And in the meantime, also we have a fall management form. And in all, we have that historical management form collects data from the past 4 years on that farm. So this is just a quick slide reminding everybody how many different products there are out there that could possibly have sulfur in them, a certain percentage of sulfur, right? I think the key takeaway here is I want to let you know that the products that we chose for those to do based on our protocol was ATS or AMS. So if you would hear Dr. Castile talk, it's a lot of AMS, recommends that as well as gypsum. A lot of his research has been on that. I think Connor, a lot of AMS, as well as what I see. He's nodding his head. There are some growers out there that are using ATS. It's easier, like kind of a liquid product for them to apply. The one key thing I want you to know about that is that ATS is half sulfate, half elemental sulfur. So that sulfate is the readily available form for that plant to take up. But you still have the elemental sulfur that's not readily available. And so I have all these kind of notes in my head that I've taken down from Dr. Castile. And I don't know if this is exactly correct, but I looked it up again. It was 300 and 400 days possibly, for the mineralization or the breakdown of that elemental sulfur into that sulfate form in order for it to be available for the plant, so keep that in mind. I also think that sometimes we don't think about some of the products that we use, perhaps the mez products that we're using for phosphorus, that we're also getting some sulfur along in there, maybe the previous year or the previous fall, so we need to take that in account as well. And I cannot do this presentation without a Bender slide, right? We've all seen this slide from Dr. Belo's lab, the famous Bender slide. This is just to let you know, so when was the sulfur applied? It was applied in the beginning, in the spring. There's also been a lot of research that we'll talk a little bit more and touch on of fall applied sulfur. But the key takeaway here is that we want to make sure the sulfur's there at the beginning of the season because in general, I've heard Connor say, the plant needs sulfur throughout the whole season, but really just starts ramping up and taking a lot of that sulfur during those reproductive stages. So don't panic, oh my gosh, it's the sulfur cycle. But there's just a couple things I just want to point out that I think a lot of farmers may take for granted. So we need sulfur. I think that Dr. Belo's lab has done a really great job of reminding us of we're getting some really high soybean yields in Illinois, and we're getting some really high removal rates, and we're gonna have to replace some of that sulfur. But we can get sulfurs in many different ways. And we think about, obviously, we're trying in this trial to apply sulfur via ATS, AMS. But I think that we take for granted that and I've already mentioned it, that some of it's in that elemental form and it's not quite available yet. Will it be available the next year? It's still there, it's hanging out. And then we also have a lot of the organic sulfur. So we are very blessed with some great soils in this state. And I think that we take for granted that some of these soils, for example, in one of our Hancock, Western Illinois locations, I think it maybe had really good weather conditions and some really great soils that made some more sulfur available for, and we might not have seen a sulfur response there. And we also have to account for, we have sulfate. So we like to compare sulfate to nitrates. So it's an anion, and it's easily lost into the soil profile. So we think that we've applied it one year and then the next year it's gone, right? Because it can leach, it can volatilize, and somehow it may not be there for us the following year, especially if we apply it in that AMS form, that's all sulfate. Is that still there? We don't know necessarily. And it depends on all these different things, and this is where it gets so complicated. And so we start looking at, I tried to list them all, I probably did not, but when you start digging into the why, we had some responses to sulfur across the state. Why? So I think the main thing that you want to look at is soils first, right? So we'll dig into that a little bit more. Obviously, I just touched on we may have some soils that may have more sulfur responses. Obviously, texture is huge. If more coarse the soil, we can have some more leaching of the sulfur. We have a lot of tiled fields, some not so much in the south, that can move sulfur, whether good or bad, mostly bad probably. Think about water holding capacity, a lot of clays throughout the state that could hold that sulfur. Organic matter is a big one. We have this north-south thing going on, right? I hear a lot. I live on Route 16. We farm both. So we have lower organic matter soils where we may not give up or have produced a lot of sulfur because of that organic matter. For example, higher organic matter may have more mineralization of sulfur, 3 to 5 pounds a year per percentage of organic matter. Less, maybe not, and we'll talk more about that. pH has a lot to do with it as well. It can influence anions. It also can cause microbes not to be happy and microbes not to do mineralization, so keep that in mind. We don't necessarily, when we talk about anions, we usually talk about anion capacity. But when we talk about cation or CEC exchange capacity, the higher the CECs, usually the better the soils that tend to have more organic matter that could possibly give us some more sulfur in our fields. The second main thing that's talked about a lot is management. And I just read an article in a farming magazine where they asked several crop consultants, if I were to use sulfur, where would I get the most bang for my buck? And of course they're listening to Dr. Castile, I am too. And the main thing that I hear is early planting. We're doing a lot of that in this state. So my question is every early planted soybean field going to get a response to sulfur? We'll talk about that. Obviously, again, huge crop demand for sulfur. Tillage, not to till or to till. When mostly with tillage, we'll look at those different things with sulfur. We think about the residue that we potentially could have with or without tillage, and that C/N ratio, so a high carbon to nitrogen ratio can help tie up that sulfur where it makes it not available for the plant, just kind of like it does for nitrogen. Again, we have to keep in mind the date that the sulfur was applied. I keep hearing a lot about the fall applied or spring applied, so we'll dive into that. And I think that I am a strip till fan. We don't do it on our own farm, but a lot of the farms that I visited, you talk about placement, and it just kind of makes sense where you're putting that nutrient in the root zone where you need it. Are we getting that sulfur down into the root zone? We need rain to get it down in there, but if it also leaches further, it's not in the root zone. And the big key, and it's going to be my grand finale, is the previous sulfur application. I really think we need to take a look at that. And the one thing that I harp on since I've been a field agronomist is the soybean variety matters. Not all soybeans are alike. So this is a glimpse of the data that we received. So what it tells me is I did see that we had 4 plots that had a yield response to sulfur. And those are based on, you can see the 3 blue stars. I also included one of the 17 plots that did have a response, but it was not significantly different than the control. But I want to talk about it. So we're going to talk about these 4 plots in specifically, and you'll also notice that I have some kind of, unfortunately, areas on the map that we were not able to perhaps collect data on thanks to Mother Nature this year. We had heavy amount of rain. Poor Southern Illinois was not able to plant in an early fashion. And we had some that weren't able to get the sulfur on in the spring. We had some that perhaps had to do a replant. The plot that was closest to me, that I was pretty excited about, that I could almost outside my back door. And then we had another one that was extremely late planted down further south that was almost like a double crop. So here is for all you management hungry people that usually ask me, well, what was the plant population? What was the row spacing on that? So we're going to quickly trying to go over what plots we had, what counties participated within these ISA on-farm trials. First off, I want to say that these, and throughout the presentation, will be according to planting date, because I want you to see those green plots are the ones where we had a sulfur response. The rest did not. So we had 4 out of so many plots that didn't have a response. They're all corn soybean except for the Perry County. That has been soybeans on soybeans for a very long time. And then we had, this is what I know and love about Illinois. This is what I love about being an agronomist in the state. Nobody farms exactly the same. Everything is different. And even row spacing, which just completely blew my mind. It was difficult taking plant populations. So we had every kind of tillage you can think of. Mostly if they did till, it was fall till, but we also had a couple locations where they fall spring tilled. We obviously had very early planting. It's almost lined up from north to south, but it's not quite. You can see the certain bureau counties there. We had all different type of populations. We had 2 locations that had variable rate populations. We also had locations that did 15-inch, 20-inch, 10-inch, 30-inch soybeans. All over the place, you can see the yields ranged there from obviously 90 to 40, and that, again, had a lot to do, not necessarily with soils, that was Mother Nature, and I attribute a lot to planting date as well. You can see now, obviously on this slide, we have a whole bunch of different organic matters. Obviously, a lot of them line up from north to south. So you can start to see right Heath where 16 is, and you start to get lower organic matter, like in my neck of the woods, and a lot of different CECs as well. So I know you can't see this slide, but the main takeaway is this is an example of some information that you will be getting in a report from us if you participated in this trial. So the first plot that I want to dive into is Bureau County. Now, I want to be transparent with you that life is not perfect. I am not perfect. This person, after we got the retail ticket, perhaps did not apply 30 pounds of sulfur, which is fine. So he applied half as much. He still had a 7.4 bushel response. So I started to dig into that, and so I looked at his soils. And so what I found is he was having a pretty high yield response on some sandy soils, which made a lot of sense to me. So some other information that you'll be getting if you participated is this texture triangle. And so what it tells me, based on the information I was given at this point in time, I can make an inference that this is probably the highest, sandiest soil that we had of a plot that took part in this ISA farm trial in 2025. So I think this was a big part, obviously, why we had such a big yield response. It's also a lower organic matter at 3%, and a medium CEC like all the others that responded. So I know what you're thinking. Well, it's lower organic matter. That makes sense, right? That's why you got a response as well, which makes sense, it's a sandy field, but not necessarily. We also had responses in other locations that had higher organic matter. Look at 4.5% organic matter. This, based on this information, it also was a little sandier as well in comparison to the rest of the participants. So that was another factor. So think this also was the example of a cover crop trial. We had others, but this was cover crop. So this is kind of like what we've been hearing from some of the researchers in Illinois and Indiana, that we sometimes get more of a response of sulfur in some of these cover crop trials, and we'll dig into that. I also want to note that the Champaign County location was not quite the driest. The driest location throughout the year was Piatt County. That was the winner of all our plots. But this Champaign location was pretty darn dry. And I think that can have effect as well, obviously, on sulfur. I don't know, I don't want to dig into it too much, but I just want you to take note of that. A lot less rain in August, where Piatt County had a lot less rain in June. And again, in that Champaign County, we had a 3.4 bushel yield increase. So next, I want to dig into the sulfur soil test. So I was always taught, don't even look at it, right? You read AI, you Google it, it says it's just not something that you can depend upon. But we did take a soil test, and I wanted to be able to look at all the other nutrients too. I want to see what's going on out there to make sure we didn't have too much noise. But what we did was we took the soil test in the spring. Spring, fall soil tests can be different. We did basically what the soil test tells me is that's a snapshot of that sulfur during when we took that soil test. So a very wise crop consultant once told me, and I use his notes, that if you have 24 or below, that can indicate low sulfur. And that was a trend across the 4 that we're focusing in on that had a yield response. But does that mean that we didn't have any other locations that also tested lower? They did, that may not have had a yield response. And then next up, I'm going to dive into some of our Again, not just soil testing, we also did tissue testing. Now, I think this is a whole nother presentation in itself, and Darby's been doing a lot of work on this, but this was to try to be in conjunction with Dr. Connor Sybil's current ISA-funded project that he's working on. And we worked with him on a protocol in order to get some data out in the field. But what you need to know, and I won't go too much into it, that we did sample at R1, and not only did we sample the top leaf, the fully not touching leaf, right, but the one below it as well. And we did that at several replications too, in each of the non-treated and the treated, and 25 plants. So that was really fun this summer. And I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Connor Sybil. His lab volunteered to also keep track of biomass. So we made sure we knew that there was exactly 25 plants in that bag so that we could also account for biomass and not just the accumulation of sulfur within that leaf. But I don't know if you've noticed when you start visiting fields that there's a lot of different biomass, size of leaves, heights, that type of thing. So this is the one thing that I want to touch on, and I don't want to overthink this, as Darby would say, but I want to just give a couple of takeaways from this. So if we look at the Champagne and the Vermilion plot locations, and these are two that responded to sulfur. And when we did their tissue test, we found that the area that had sulfur was testing with a much higher sulfur concentration than the control that didn't have any sulfur applied to it. That also lined up with our soil test. Wow, if everything was just that perfect. But those two plots did align with that. That could also be attributed to the plant variety, the variety response as well. I also want to make sure and let you know that we also did not always see this. There was some plots, for example, I grabbed Menard as an example. Its baseline soil test that we took was 31.25, so what we would say a little bit, it was the highest of all of our plots, highest sulfur soil test. We did not see much of a difference between in the sulfur concentration within the sulfur treatment versus that without. And next up, look at that residue. How about that? So we did take a lot of field notes and we had pictures. And so at almost all the locations, we had very heavy residue, Champaign County, Knox County, Vermilion. And they're like, okay, so I know what you're thinking. You're gonna get a response with sulfur if you're no-till. Not necessarily. The Knox County location was fall tillage, but still, look at all that nice residue out there. And so these are some other attributes that we saw with some of the sulfur responses. So really high residue. And so within that Knox County location, I want to note that it was not ATS. This is one of the few locations that they used AMS. And it was also one of the only locations where they also compared it to ATS. So we had more of a response in this location in Knox County with AMS versus ATS, which again, reminder, AMS is more of the sulfate in the sulfate form. And so next up, I want to go over some of the different variety responses that we had within the field. This is in Knox County, where we clearly saw that we had more height to where we had an ATS and AMS application. We also saw more pods, and that did equate to higher yields. We also, again, saw different responses and varieties where we started to see different, not always, but in the two counties, Vermilion and Champaign, we started to see some differences in the varieties where how they responded. In this example, in Vermilion County, where we didn't apply sulfur, we saw more green stems. This was also, Vermilion County was a location that we saw height differences. Again, the ATS was taller than the control. And again, higher pod count did not necessarily attribute to yield. as an example. And then lastly was Champaign County. And I also want to note that this was a no fungicide insecticide location. And another really cool thing about this was the control did not possess nitrogen in it. And we did not see height differences within these two locations. So one would infer that that nitrogen was given a height boost, and not necessarily, we didn't see any yield differences, but a height difference with when we added that nitrogen to it. We did see a little bit of difference. You can barely see it in the pictures where those beans in the control were a little bit greener than those that weren't. So slight varietal differences there. I also want to point out Vermilion County was a non-GMO. This is a GMO, so I just want to make you aware of that as well. And so lastly, the grand finale is the one main thing that Darby and I kept seeing within the data when we were combing through a lot of this management data, when we were looking at the last 4 years, a lot of these participants are adding nitrogen to their corn. And so when we looked at 2024, Darby made up this actual rating scale, none, low, average, high, very high scale. And so we put that to a lot of the plots. And so what we found is a lot of the plots that responded to sulfur hadn't had any sulfur applied in 24, either none or very, very low. And then I know what you're thinking. I have this favorite person I watch that's an influencer. She's always like, after she makes her recipe, she's like, I know what you're thinking. Is it even good? Now, was it even economical? So I will start out with, no, I do not want you to apply 30 pounds of sulfur. That is not economical. So go with the 15 or 20. But what we did was Darby dived into some of the economics of that one Vermilion County plot that was not significantly higher than the control. And was it even economical? Well, he barely broke even based on that 2.5 bushels. And that was only because he locked in his ATS at a previous price in 24 at 320. If he had not locked into that price, it would have been $400 per ton in 24. And no, it would not have been economical. And so if you want to read more about this is going to be an article by Darby Danzel, and it'll be in the Future Illinois Field and Bean article, and really gave some good insights. So lastly, these are Stephanie's thoughts. And I swear I did listen to lots of Dr. Connor Sybil presentations, and I purposely did not look at his notes until after I was finished with this presentation. But I do think a lot of things are starting to match up. I do want to give Nick Sider a shout out as well. When we were down in the Perry County plot, he says that there's a lot of Decty stem borers there. We saw them everywhere. I'm like, Nick's right. They're everywhere down here. So we were able to kind of connect his ISA research as well. But I think the main thing that farmers need to take into consideration, and a lot of this is not rocket science. This is things that we've been hearing over and over for years, is obviously sandy soils have more of a response to sulfur. But we really need to pay attention to some of those soil series that can give us sulfur and then take that into account and don't discount that. A lot of us do have some of these soils that can offer sulfur. One of the things that Connor said in one of his previous presentations that resonated with me and was in my notes is, are those sulfates sticking around longer? Can we apply ATS in the fall? That's something that Mulvaney, he accounted that Mulvaney had found or asked in his research, and then he also asked that question, and so we also are applying a lot of sulfur to corn previously. The other thing that we have to talk about with cover crops is the first thing we think about is residue mineralization, tie-up. We're not getting that nutrient into the plant, but Cover crops are plants too. They need nutrients too. And they do great things and scavenge some of those nutrients that we don't want to lose. But are they scavenging sulfur as well? And then lastly, how bad is that residue tie-up? Obviously, the more residue we have, the higher C to N ratio, the worse it is. But Connor Sybil points out that those microbes doing that mineralization, they need nutrients too. They need nitrogen and sulfur too. And Darby Dansel's done some of that research. And so another thing to ponder upon. Sulfur is not just needed for lower organic matter soils. Also needed in low situations where they would respond in higher CECs or higher organic soils as well. And this is a thing that Darby laughed at me, but I said, she's like, I've heard it way more than you. But we keep hearing the Dr. Belo's lab saying soybeans prefer old fertility. So something else to ponder upon. Should we be applying AMS in the fall? Should we be applying it in spring? Some questions I want you to ask Dr. Castile. Also, how does sulfur affect the seed protein levels or grain quality? We would have loved to do this year. We just didn't have the woman power to do it. There was just so many things to do, so little time. And then lastly, the big question remains, will 2026 on-farm trial sulfur trial results be different or will they be the same? So to be continued, and that concludes some of my insights from this year's ISA OFTN trials.
I'm asking you to stay on stage because I want to get 6 minutes before you get turned loose into the crowd. If that's okay. Any quick questions for Stephanie? Over here.
So you were talking about sulfur fertility in the past year on the previous corn crop. Was there a consistent source, like were they all sulfate sources that were used the year before?
We're on camera now, so if you could repeat that too for the viewing audience on either YouTube or Facebook.
That is a really good question that I did not memorize. There was all sorts of different sulfur sources used the previous year. I would say there's not one. I would say mainly AMS, ATS, if I recall. And there's a lot of, I know across the state, a lot of MES products that are being used. So does that help answer your question?
There was one in the middle. Hold that thought just a second.
Has anybody looked into mixing either AMS or ATS with any pre-emerge herbicides to try and decrease some of the application costs there?
Yes, that is one thing that Darby noted in her article that I didn't want to go too much into because I only had 30 minutes. But yes, I asked that question at our farmer meeting. At least one of the farmer meetings, 2 people raised their hand. Remember to take into account, but you don't want to add too much. You're not getting a lot there with your pre, but you are accounting for some. And that's the other thing that I forgot to point out is that you can apply sulfur in different ways on the planter in the same pass, and you don't have to account for that additional pass that we did in our protocol where we had to account for application costs. So you can kind of reduce that as well.
Over here. Then we got a break.
I was wondering on your yield data collection, is that weigh wagons or some people providing yield monitor data, or where does?
It's yield monitor data that is cleaned up. We contract that out. And if you have any more questions on that, see Jim Eiserman in the back of the room.
Okay. Thanks, Stephanie. Good questions. We're about to break.